day, and I give the floor to Rostyslav Tomenchuk, chairman of the Ukrainian Institute for International Politics, and Kateryna Sydash, who is the head of the analytics department of this institute, will talk about biometric passports, and the colleagues will present a research about biometric passports in European Union. Good afternoon, Rostyslav Tomenchuk, Kateryna Sydash, my colleague. Over the recent years, when there were the plans for association were drawn and the implementation started, we monitored the introduction of biometric passports in Ukraine. We welcome this fact, and taking into account the fact that there was an active discussion about the price of biometric passports and the procedures, both in mass media and the expert opinion, whether they were cheap or expensive in Ukraine, what's the situation in other countries. So we decided to approach this systemically and to dispel some rumors about biometric passports, and we prepared the research about the situation in EU and other countries. You can take copies next to the entrance to the room, and we want to dwell on some details of this research in this presentation. Right to the thing. So the comparative review of the introduction of biometric passports in the world, more than 90 countries out of 193 UN members have introduced biometric passports, as ICAO says, and 20 are planning to introduce them as soon as possible. So this is the world trend to switch to biometric documents, and the first impetus was given by 9/11 in 2001, when, as a result of a terrorist attack against the US, the foundations of international security were reviewed, and the US have introduced the global system of security of documents. And the US since then started and still collect biometric information about everyone who applies for visa in this country, who gets visa, and who enters the USA. And in fact, the US have introduced the standards of collecting biometric information on everyone who wants to cross the U.S. border. By the way, the U.S. have not introduced internal biometric documents apart from U.S. military. Those who Belarus, Mongolia, almost no one in Africa, and only Azerbaijan out of the countries of Eastern Partnership don't have biometric passports. In the EU, this process has started in the beginning of 2000s, and there was number 2 resolution directive, EU Directive 2252, that regulated the order of introduction and parameters and the order of collecting and storing the biometric information for EU countries. This was a recommendation for member states. This was not a direct action document, but they recommended some standards for domestic legislation. It does not cover Ireland and UK, but it does cover Norway, Iceland, and other countries who are not members of the EU. So some of the main parameters introduced by this document, and they are also supported by the International Civil Aviation Organization. This is the digital photo, the scan of your fingertips and fingerprints, and the scan of your retina, and they also say that the digital face image is the main parameter and has to be introduced by all means, while the scan of your eye and the scan of your fingerprints are facultative, additional, and they almost do not mention electronic signature. However, our authorities have introduced this into our documents, but we think that it is very hard to distinguish between real electronic signature and possible fakes. As of today, the European Union supports two main parameters, the digital photo and the digital fingerprints. At the beginning, there was no clear regulation about the number of fingers, and in 2009 they have introduced amendments and another directive of the EU, which said that these should be two identical fingers on two hands. It also says that people under 12 should not have their fingerprints scanned, and also where physically this is impossible, like there is no physical possibility to scan the fingerprints. The scan of the eye was introduced in the UK, although later it was partially cancelled. In 2012, they have just suspended this. This is also selectively used in Sweden, and United Arab Emirates and India have introduced the system of eye scan as the major biometric parameter in their countries. If you travel through the Netherlands, then in Schiphol airport you will see this, because this is a component of the security system of this airport. It is also introduced in the Nexus system, which acts on the border between US and Canada. But this parameter has not become predominant in the international practice. Also, by the documents of the International Civil Aviation Organization, they introduced the international designation, stamp of the international of the biometric passports, and we have it on Ukrainian biometric passports as well. Then another issue which is defined by EU directives and local legislation is the duration. The duration of the validity of the passport is 5 to 10 years, but in some cases they are being issued for a shorter period, for instance, for adolescents, and in some cases when there are people who have to go to military service in some countries. But generally it is 5 to 10 years. And also the introduction of the passports of the previous model. The general practice is that when biometric passports are being issued, then the country does not issue simple passports, and they switch over. They remain legal, but they gradually switch to biometric passports. The exceptions here are Romania, Armenia, and Norway, but this happens only in separate cases. In Romania, for instance, they can issue a passport of the old model for a year, and it is not valid for Schengen visa and all this kind of stuff, and for the US. In Armenia, they have introduced this passport for men younger than 18 because of the fact that those men have to go to military service when they reach 18. Then the price of the biometric passport, I guess this is the subject of special interest to everyone, and Yaroslav Tomenchuk will talk about this.
When we started analyzing the cost of biometric passports, we realized that there's no clear interrelation between which country issues what.
Може коштувати менше 20 євро.
But basically, the cheapest biometrical passport cannot cost less than 20 euros. Not a single country was issuing the biometric passport which would cost less than 20 euros. The countries which do not have stable economic growth, where the incomes are not big, the cost of biometrical passports was between 20 to 30, 35, 40 euros. Another thing is that in Ukraine, for a long time, the issue was discussed that the cost of the passport is such, and the price for it when issuing would be different in the European Union. They were not discussing what should be the cost of the passport, because the state does not sell the document but provides for the rules according to which the passport is efficient, and that included the work of different bodies, those which were issuing the passport, and the civil servants who are putting their contribution into this, making their contribution into this biometrical passport. So we looked at what is the cheapest and the most expensive biological passport, biometrical passport. So the five most expensive passports are in the following countries: 169 euros. All of our prices were tied up to foreign currency. The second is Italy, 116, then Switzerland, 114, Canada, 107, and Great Britain, 97 euros. To understand how really whether this is a comfortable price, we also indicate the average salaries in these countries. If you analyze where is the most expensive and the cheapest passport in correlation to the average salary, then Australia and Italy are leaders in this list. So I would like to take Italy as an example. Last year, the cost of the passport in Italy was about 50 euros, but there were some other taxes that people had to pay when making the passport, and Italy made the decision not to differentiate between all these taxes. They defined one price, 116 euros, and all the taxes were included into the cost of the passport. Even previously, Italians were paying the same amount of money, but that was split into several components before. Another interesting thing, the Netherlands and the Belgium, which are not here, they use the principle of decentralization when forming the price for the passport and allowed municipalities to charge some surplus money for the passport. So depending on which in which region the passport is issued, the cost of the passport could change. The local authorities leave some amount from the cost of the passport, but they take the responsibility for the procedure of issuing the passports. Talking about our neighbors, the most expensive one is the passport issued in Romania, and the average salary in Romania is much lower than in Belgium, but the cost of the passport in Belgium and Romania is the same, about 70 euros. And the cost of the passport of 70 euros, the passport is issued for 5 years. There's a passport which is issued for 10 years, and there are cases when the passport is issued for 5 years. In the European Union, there's also the principle those people who are frequent travelers, they can make the passport with a big number of pages because so that they can longer use these passports in Ireland and in some other countries. There's also an interesting thing introduced when privileges are provided for disabled people and some other social groups. Each country, when they make these passports, they consider that this cost of the passport is an additional tax and they can increase or reduce the cost of the passport. And the next slide has the cheapest passports. And the cheapest one is in Bulgaria, 20 euros, Bosnia Herzegovina, 20 euros, Czech Republic, 22 euros. Similar prices in Morocco. 25 euros Spain, and Estonia 28 euros. Analyzing it, only Spain with the average salary, which is in Spain 1,615 euros. The cost of the passport of 25 euros is the cheapest that we've seen. We use the same scheme for biometrical passports in Ukraine. We said that the cost of the Ukrainian passport should be around 26 euros, but people do not get the salary of 1,600 euros, do not even receive the salary of 322 euros. So the equivalent of the cost of the Ukrainian passport if we compare with different countries, is the most expensive, unfortunately, and that contradicts the thesis when people were saying that the cost is cheap. It's cheap if we look at this cost, but it's more difficult for people to afford the passport in Ukraine than in the countries of European Union. So the similar situation is in Armenia and Moldova. Talking about the correlation of the money that people earn and compared to the cost of the biometrical passport, we unfortunately see that dynamic. We do not have the cheapest or the most expensive passport compared to Moldova, compared to Armenia. In Moldova, the biometrical passport costs more than 40 euros, and we have 26 euros, but we understand that the average salary in Moldova is higher than in Ukraine. You can pick up the copy of our research at the reception. Now we will enumerate some of the recommendations if we still have time. We welcome the process taking place in Ukraine, the process of introducing biometrical passports in Ukraine. We understand it's very complicated. There are difficulties, and we prepared some recommendations to the Cabinet of Ministers, the committees of the Verkhovna Rada, and NGOs which are fighting corruption. So we recommend for transparency to stop, to refuse from several payments for the biometrical passport. This could be done by either increasing the state duty so that the people do not have to pay separately for making the passport, separately for providing services, and separately for the document itself. In Moldova, they have one price and people pay just once. So this will ensure more transparency. People will understand that all this money that are paid for the passport go to the budget, and they do not pay for some services which may have some corruption component. We also recommend to remove the percentage for banking services. I believe we can create the transparent system, and banks will be interested in receiving money for the passport without charging the percentage for that. In the European countries, in Moldova, people pay by the credit card, and they do not have to pay any percentage for banking transaction. That's a new proposal. And also to involve the centers of providing administrative services so that they issue the passports. Also, the local authorities will be involved so that some part of the cost of the passport should be left locally. That will be a pilot project and the example of how the decentralization process is going on and how the local authorities are involved, and they this way will be more interested in providing services of high quality. Also, if the amount, if people just pay once and this money go into the budget, we understand what services we pay for. Also, we address the organizations who are fighting corruption to analyze the possible involvement of some intermediary companies into procurement of the certain equipment for issuing biometrical passports. I believe that the authorities are interested in getting the biometrical passports as soon as possible so that this year we get the visa-free regime. Your colleagues, to our speaker, your questions.
This biometric passport I got a week ago, but I cannot take it to a consulate section or to the embassy because they tell us that Ukraine has issued some unknown documents. Thank you very much. This issue is being discussed over the last week in on the internet and in mass media. The matter is that you cannot open a Schengen visa with your biometric passport. The problem is that all the consular sections, for instance, if we take Polish embassies, they have several consulates in several cities, and every consulate should have a blank biometric passport, and the Cabinet of Ministers has not sent out the right number of blank passports to consulates so that they can compare it to samples to actual passports. But as we've been told at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, this will be rectified over this week. They know about this and they try to do this as soon as possible to send the samples to embassies and consulates. Other questions? Well, no questions at the moment. Thank you very much. If there are no questions, I'd like to add, while analyzing the price of and the cost of the passports, we thought that it is not important whether they are cheap or expensive. The matter is about the policy of the state. If the state wants to issue the maximum number of the biometric passports so that people do go abroad and see what Europe is, we would see here, for instance, pensioners, those people who do not leave the boundaries of the administrative district, for instance. But now when, for instance, children want to take their parents to Europe and show them what life there is, they cannot receive passports for them. This is the policy of the state. Every country, while forming their policy in this respect, were guided by the policy that they are conducting. For instance, if the countries of the Eastern Partnership are not interested in making their countries open, for instance, Armenia, they would raise the price of biometric passports. If there are difficulties in Belarus and their policy does not provide for the approximation with the European Union, then they will also not introduce any benefits. But all the countries that are interested in this, they will introduce certain amendments which will help the country become more open to the world. As for Ukraine, it is not about so much about the high price for the passport as about the low income some Ukrainians. Well, we will have biometric passports. I'm from the Trade Union Federation. Everybody knows that even with the visas valid for 5 years, I, for instance, have a 5-year visa, but from mass media, I got to know that, for instance, I have a French 5-year visa, and if I go into France and then to Belgium, then I can be sent back. So in this case, what does this biometric passport give us if the European countries protecting themselves from Ukrainians just annul this visa and send us back? So we get the Schengen visa that allows you only to enter the country that you enter. Well, of course, there are provisions that a European Union country can issue national visas, which they do not do very often. I understood you. If we come back to the biometric passport in Ukraine, it does not change the procedure very much. For instance, a customs officer can ask you what is the aim of the visit, where is your hotel booked, and why are you going there. Biometric passport does not forbid to do this. Well, there are demands, and the country, your first port of entry should be in the country where the country to the country that issued your visa. But the cases are that, for instance, I have the visa issued by France, and I enter France and then go to Brussels, but they may tell me in France, you should not go to Belgium, you should remain in France. So what kind of Schengen visa this is if they actually make a national visa out of it? And we see this every day. For instance, Poles do this quite often, who have issued a lot of Schengen visas, but now they are sending our citizens back. And with the biometric passport, it is actually becoming stricter for Ukraine. There's no direct link between the fact that you can be asked at any moment where are you going and the fact that you have or don't have a biometric passport. Understanding that the European Union is fighting embezzlement and terrorism and fraudulent use of visas, if a customs officer has a question or questions to a certain individual, they can check your document and find some discrepancies, for instance, with the aim of your visit or with the direction of your travel. These are singular cases, and I think that we should regard them separately in every case. Whether the biometric passport will be able to simplify the situation, to a certain extent, yes, because the level of protection is going to be higher, but we cannot be sure that we will be able to avoid the dialogue with customs officers. As far as I know, this situation emerged over the recent half year, and in reality, this is a sort of reaction to the fact that visas were not used with the aim that they were issued. If we talk about biometric passport, it does not provide for obligatory issuance of visa. We're talking about the security of collecting data and crossing the borders. We're talking that when the biometric passport is introduced, the European Union gives you a certain plan about the introduction of visa-free regime, and biometric passports are a necessary condition for a visa-free regime. So this is just one of the steps on our way to the visa-free regime between the European Union and Ukraine. There are some forecasts that this is going to happen by the end of this year or in the beginning of the next year, but the biometric passport in itself only collects and stores your data and does not offer you the heightened possibilities of visa-free travel. Interest and